Well, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, is claiming that this is the best possible deal that Britain could reach with the EU. But quite frankly, it's much worse than us staying in the EU as we still are at the moment. Because basically what it would mean is that in, for example, trade in goods, we would effectively still be part of the customs union and to a certain degree the single market, and therefore having to obey EU rules and regulations, but we would no longer have any say. We would no longer have any members of the European Parliament, which we currently vote for. We would no longer have a British commissioner within the EU Commission. So basically what it is very much second best to what we have already, but we would be paying into the European Union billions of pounds a year for several years to come. Because although in principle we'll be leaving the European Union on the 29th of March next year, in fact we would then enter a transition period which would go on for quite a long time.
Okay, well, Jonathan, do you think that Theresa May negotiated the best deal for London? Because you just said that you feel that perhaps it's not that good. But if it's not the best deal for London, why do you think that she has agreed or negotiated the deal in the way she has so far?
Well, I think we have to admit it's not actually Theresa May herself who's been doing the negotiations, except at the summits or councils. Effectively, it's been the exiting the EU ministers, and as Camilla said in her report at the beginning of the programme, we've lost two of those already, David Davis, who was in charge for quite a long time, and then Dominic Raab, and both showed a high degree, frankly, of incompetence in the way they handled this. It was clear they didn't understand what the possibilities were, because the EU is a rules-based organisation, and if you're leaving a club, which is what Britain apparently is doing, you can't expect that club to change its rules in order to favour the country that's leaving.
Okay.
And so these were really high hopes that were completely unreasonable. And I have to say that Jeremy Corbyn suggesting that somehow a Labour government could negotiate something better is really in dreamland, because Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, has said very firmly, that's it, that's the EU withdrawal agreement. It's either that or no deal, which would be a disaster, or no Brexit.
Okay. All right, Tony Goslin's joined us from Bristol now. Your take on all of this, as far as how do you see overall this draft and what it does for the UK?
Well, for a start, okay, we're looking at the programme at the moment. What's going to happen with this draft is it's going next weekend to be scrutinised by the EU, and then over the next week after that it will be by the individual governments, and what we know is that apparently they're going to approve this. Now this really is an EU deal, but there's two major things missing from it, at least. One is that we need a limited transition period, so that is to say when Britain leaves, there will be some kind of transition for a limited period of time, maybe 1 year, possibly up to 2 years, but this has got an open-ended transition. And we all know what that means. It could last for a very long time. The other thing is the Irish border issue, which should never have been conceded in the first place by Theresa May. And I don't actually blame David Davis or Dominic Raab here, because it's quite clear on some of these major issues, the Prime Minister herself has intervened in order to say, well, we think we should keep the Irish border as it is, an open border. This is ridiculous. You can't keep Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom and still have an open border. You need to have a hard border there. So there are several things she's done wrong. Then what happens in a few weeks' time is the deal will come back to the British Parliament to be looked at by the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Of course, the Commons is the most important by far. And at that point, it's almost certainly the deal will be dead, because the Labour Party is almost certainly going to be attacking the deal because they want to see the government fall. Now, there's been a lot of resignations this week, but as far as I can see, not really enough, because if the Conservative Party individual members of Parliament actually were able to bite the bullet now, look into the future, they will see, well, this deal is going nowhere. So the Prime Minister should not really be being backed by the present MPs because of that very fact. They should not be kicking the can down the road as been being done for the last 2 years in these negotiations. And they should really be biting the bullet and saying, well, this deal is not going to work. We need to have a deal which will work, and then we'll back maybe a new Prime Minister.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, your take. Do you think that the Parliament will vote in favour of this agreement? Because, of course, Tony said he didn't think so.
I don't think so either. I don't think there is any chance, as we say idiomatically, a snowball in hell's chance of this deal being accepted by the Parliament, not only because the Labour Party has made clear that it will oppose it, the Liberal Democrats will oppose it, the Scottish Nationalists will oppose it, the DUP, the Northern Ireland little party, which is backing the Theresa May government at the moment, has said it will oppose it because it's unhappy about the idea.
So then what? So then what is going to happen, Jonathan? So the Parliament doesn't approve it, and then what?
Well, we then enter completely uncharted waters because presumably the British government will say to the EU and its member states, please, can we renegotiate it? And as I mentioned earlier, Angela Merkel and others are almost certain to say, no, you can't. That was the deal. If you weren't able to get it through the British Parliament, it suggests perhaps that it's not the best deal that there could have been. But there is one point I'd like to pick up from what your other contributor said about Northern Ireland and the issue of a hard border. It would be absolutely disastrous if a hard border were brought between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because for many years there were troubles, there were conflicts, assassinations, all sorts of problems, sectarian problems around the Northern Ireland border. And thanks to the Good Friday Agreement, or Belfast Agreement as it's sometimes called, we've now have a more or less peace in that region. If a hard border came in with border checks and customs posts, etc., there have been warnings from both sides of the divide that this could lead to civil disobedience and indeed killings once again.
Well, Tony, in your perspective, do you think that there would be a new election on the Brexit? Why not hold another referendum?
Well, let me just deal with that point about Northern Ireland, because I lived really close to the border in Northern Ireland for a while back in the 1990s, and I'm afraid it's just simply not true. What's been happening, we heard warnings about killings and the return to violence. These are actually threats by people who want a united Ireland. Now, I actually would like to see ultimately a united Ireland, but let's not use these threats to say you can't have a border. What they're saying is that effectively that Northern Ireland is going to have to leave the United Kingdom. And this was always a Trojan horse to make this deal unwinnable. And really, it was a way of getting a sort of something for the Irish Republic. You know, a Trojan horse for a united Ireland to try and put that in the deal as a little favour for the Irish Republic, who are staying, of course, in the European Union. So anyway, when you're talking about another referendum, we've had a referendum, and a lot of people have been saying as well that, and I would agree with this, that to have another referendum, you're going to get either the same result, or you're going to get people from the right wing, I'm talking about your Tommy Robinsons, the extreme right, are going to start gaining more support, because they will be saying, well, we've had the referendum, we've decided this, and now you've decided you don't like what we say, and so you're trying to change the result. And this will be actually a recruiting sergeant for the far right here in Britain, and we really don't want that. I think we just need to bite the bullet and make this decision. But I've always said the most likely deal is going to be a no deal, because the European Union want this to be as chaotic as possible in Britain. It's really important to understand that there are many countries in the European Union who want to get out. Greece, Italy, Spain, Austria, Hungary, and even France and Germany. The actual populations of those countries would almost certainly vote to leave the EU if they had the opportunity to vote, but they're not being given that opportunity. And so the European Union has to make Britain pay for this decision, and they're going to punish Britain as much as they can. The idea is, I think, to have a no-deal Brexit, which it looks like is definitely on the cards now, more than ever, and to have Britain suffer economically as a result. And that's what they want to do, to punish us for having the temerity to have a referendum and to actually allow the people to decide.
What about that, Jonathan? What's your perspective on what Tony just said?
I respect Tony's opinion, but I disagree completely, as you might expect. Excuse me. I mean, basically, the EU does not want to punish Britain. Indeed, it is hoping for as smooth an arrangement as possible, though, of course, it would prefer that we don't leave the EU at all. But the EU is going to suffer from Britain leaving, just as Britain is going to suffer. And it's just not true, I'm sorry, to say that the people in other European member states want to leave the EU. Opinion polls have repeatedly shown that most people right across the EU want to stay in the EU. In the Irish Republic, it's over 85%.
If you remember, the opinion poll said we were going to vote to remain. The opinion poll said we were going to remain, and we voted the opposite way.
Basically, the EU has brought a great deal of prosperity to most of Europe. Now, about the referendum, or the people's vote, as it's called popularly here in Britain, I think the point to bear in mind is that the vote in the summer of 2016 asked a binary question: do you want to remain or leave the European Union? And there was a very narrow majority, 52 to 48, to leave. And that gave a mandate to the Conservative government to try to negotiate a deal. But I think it's perfectly logical and democratic for the government then to go to the people again and say, well, this is the deal we've got. Are you happy with that? Is that what you thought you were voting for? And we know, again, from opinion polls, of which Tony, I know, is sceptical, that many people are not happy with the deal and they don't think this is what they voted for.
Well, what about Tony's perspective? He said if that happens, it's almost actually increasing the extreme right and basically saying that there was no confidence in what the British people said to begin with. Your take on that, Jonathan?
Well, I would say that is a sort of threat, rather than, as Tony was arguing, there might be threats about problems in Northern Ireland or on either side of the border. Of course, we must follow very closely what the far right in this country is doing. But let's be honest, it's much smaller in this country than it is in many of the European Union states. We think, for example, of Hungary and Poland, for example.
Okay.
And the issue is to control civil unrest, not to say, no, we won't have another referendum, because that might encourage the far right.
Okay. Well, Tony, you were disagreeing with what Jonathan was saying when talking about prosperity that the UK has gained from being part of the EU. You disagree with that, what he's saying?
Well, more importantly, the countries that have been stuck in the Eurozone of the euro currency have had a terrible time. In Italy now, we've got a large majority of people in Italy want to leave the EU. They have had a terrible time with the euro, and the European Central Bank are now holding a gun to the head of the political leadership in Italy and saying, well, you know, you've got to have to do as you're told. They want to have what they call a universal basic income for every single citizen in Italy because there's so much unemployment. They want to make sure people are not starving. And the European Central Bank and the EU are saying to the Italian political leadership, no, you can't do that. So it's quite clear we've got here a political union. The EU is run by cartels. We've got a new president coming into the EU next year to replace the previous president, Juncker. Now, there's going to be no elections that people can vote in for that. We've already been told who it's going to be, pretty much. It's going to be Manfred Weber from Germany is going to be taking it over. And that's why people don't want it, because there's no opportunity to vote these people out. Who is Manfred Weber, you might well say? Well, he's the person we're being told, a German failed politician who is going to be taking over. And that's the problem with the EU. At the actual pinnacle of political power, all you've got is a bunch of failed politicians, and the policy is made by the cartels that run the big companies are all in cartels, the oil cartels, the steel cartels that run it. And the British population have had enough of it, and most of the rest of Europe have had enough of this system too.
Well, what about that, Jonathan? That does seem to be the case when we see this shift towards populism and not wanting the EU to interfere so much, because as our guest has just said, as Tony just said, that basically you cannot even vote for the one who's heading the EU. I mean, isn't that a paradox in what's supposed to be symbolic of the Western democracy?
Well, two things there. Basically, on the what's sometimes been called the democratic deficit of the EU, I agree absolutely. The European Commission President, which is what Tony was talking about, should be elected, not appointed. The way it's done at the moment is whoever is the candidate put forward by the largest party in the European elections, which will take place May next year, automatically becomes the Commission President. Personally, I would support a direct election for the Commission President, and indeed for the Commission of the President of the Council of Ministers, which at the moment is Donald Tusk from Poland. So I think it's important, yes, there is more democracy there, but you know, I think it really is a bit rich to sort of suggest that the EU is somehow a form of evil dictatorship run by cartels. That I just don't think that is the case at all. I absolutely agree that the EU has not engaged enough with the citizens of the member states. And certainly in this country, in Britain, many people had no idea really what the EU does. Even though we've been members for 45 years now. Indeed, it was telling that the day after the EU referendum in 2016, the most common search on Google in Britain was, "What is the EU?" Bit late.
Okay, well, Tony, last question, because we're running rapidly out of time. What does all this mean? What do you see the future for your country in dealing with all this?
Well, you know, Britain is facing a bit of a test, isn't it, at the moment? And I mean, we are in a real serious problem with Theresa May as Prime Minister, because she's given us a deal which is something that the EU like, particularly because it's open-ended, but the British public didn't vote for. So Parliament is going to reject it. I think we are potentially going to have either a new leadership. I would suggest you'll probably see somebody like Boris Johnson or David Davis as a new Prime Minister once this deal is rejected by Parliament, and probably somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg as the Chancellor here. All of these people would be much tougher with the EU in making sure that certain parts of this agreement are not part of it. I mean, particularly the Northern Ireland thing, for example. We need to keep the country together. It's a humiliation by the EU to say, oh, actually, we're going to break up your country as part of this deal.
Okay.
But let's not forget that the whole EU project was funded by the Americans originally in the 1950s, and it was based on the idea that was brought up by the Nazis in the Second World War in 1942 in order to run occupied Europe. It's called the European Economic Community. In 1942, the Germans called it the Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft. It was their system to run occupied Europe during the Second World War.
We need to definitely, hopefully, we'll have another program talking more about it, but we're out of time for now. I appreciate both of you being with us. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. Jonathan Fryer, author and lecturer out of London. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marcia Hashimi. See you next time.